We're all across the country obviously worried about election security, the ability for our democratic rights to actually mean something in practice. And there are various forms of influence over elections, both in terms of domestic political spending, but also foreign political spending that we are growing increasingly worried about. And joining us now to break down one proposal that would help to solve some of these problems, Ron Fine, legal director for Free Speech for People, joins us now on the Damage Report.
Hi, it's a pleasure to join you.
We're glad to have you here, Ron. And so talk to me about a proposal that you're backing. You've got a write-up on it that people could get some details from that has to do with foreign influence corporations and political spending.
That's right. So when people think of foreign influence in our elections, they may first leap to something like the Kremlin with clandestine intelligence services directly trying to interfere, and that certainly can happen. But a more subtle form occurs when foreign investors use US corporations, use their ownership stakes in those companies to leverage the corporate treasury and their influence over it in political spending. And that's something that comes out of the Citizens United decision that the Supreme Court issued in 2010. But our legislation aims to cut back on that to the extent that we can under that decision.
So I want to get into some of the components of the legislation, but first, when you talk about these foreign influence corporations, I want to get an idea of the scope of the problem. So how common is this that corporations, like, are we talking about dozens of corporations, hundreds, thousands of corporations? And how big are some of these corporations in terms of their impact on the overall American economy and the politics of certain states?
The extreme cases are those where a corporation might be wholly owned by a foreign government. But there's a much larger, if more subtle problem, which is that in our large multinational corporations, most of them have a small but significant percentage of foreign investment. And while it may not seem like a small ownership stake could have a big influence on corporate governance, it turns out that owning even 1% of corporate stock in a Fortune 500 corporation, it gives an investor substantial influence over what that corporation does. So when you think of foreign influenced corporations, don't just think of those where it might be that the Saudi government owns a major stake, but just think of virtually every S&P 500 company has a percentage of foreign ownership that in some cases, even with just a few percent, is enough that they can influence the corporate governance and how they spend money on elections.
And so that's the current situation. So now talk to me about the legislation. What would it seek to do to change this situation?
So the legislation has two main parts. One of them is to define a foreign influenced corporation as one that has a percentage of foreign investment as small as 1% from a single foreign investor, and say that those cannot spend any money at all in Seattle city elections. And that includes spending it directly or giving it to a super PAC. And the other component of the legislation says that nobody, corporation or otherwise, can give more than $5,000 to a super PAC. And these work independently, but when you put them together, they offer a powerful rebuke to some of the recent corporate political activity that we've seen in Seattle just this last election.
So my team did a little bit of research into those Seattle, the city council elections. And generally when I think about those sorts of local elections, I think that these are, there's probably not a ton of voter interest. There's probably not a lot of money being spent. But in 2019, $13 million was raised just for city council elections in Seattle. That seems like a lot. Why so much interest on the part of these super PACs, the corporations that are funding them, for the outcome of these Seattle City Council elections?
Well, it was a remarkable pace of corporate political spending in Seattle that outstripped anything that had been seen before. And a lot of it was driven by Amazon as a result of some recent proposals that the city council had, in one case, enacted in order to reduce the power and influence of Amazon and other companies, which have the ability right now to really dictate living conditions in Seattle, but try to avoid as much as possible paying for any of their impacts on the city. So whether you support those particular policies or not, is not the issue. The issue is that Amazon decided that it was going to try to unseat the entire city council and dumped $1.5 million into a super PAC to do exactly that.
Wow. And I would predict that as this process goes forward for this legislation, you'll probably face some opposition from the same sorts of interests. I know that you helped to draft this type of ordinance in St. Petersburg, Florida. What was that process like?
Well, in St. Petersburg, which has already passed an ordinance like this in late 2017, there was some opposition, both from some members of the public and also on the city council. But the larger body of the public, many of whom were extremely active in coming to city council meetings and letting their voices be heard, were very clear and very strong that they wanted the elections in St. Petersburg to be for the people of St. Petersburg and not to be driven by large donations from wealthy and corporate interests.
So if people would like more information about the scope of the problem and what you're planning to do to help solve it, where can they get more information on that?
We have a website, freespeechforpeople.org, and we have a nice page that describes everything going on in the Seattle legislation and also broader efforts to challenge political spending and the unfair dominance of wealthy and corporate interests in our campaigns.
Ron Fine, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.